Right, let's begin. Good afternoon. Just to quickly recap, so I'm Mario Powell, I'm a children's author, and welcome to the 5th workshop. So we're now kind of halfway through of this creative writing course. To quickly summarize, this is a 10-week course which is designed to help you to improve your creative writing. And following the introductory workshop in week 1, where we talked about getting started and finding your inspiration. In week 2, we talked about characterization, the process of creating characters. And then in week 3, we talked about settings, so creating an environment in which our story is told. And then last week, we talked about how we can structure our stories. So in what I like to call a framework that I use called the 7 steps to story structure. If you haven't watched any of those videos, or if you've missed them, you can check them out on my Facebook page or YouTube channel. Today we're going to talk about narrative voice. These are different ways in which we can write our stories. There's people still tuning in. I'm just going to welcome a few. Angelica from Colombia, fantastic. Thank you, Angelica. Henry, Lauren, and Jennifer from Devon, thank you for tuning in. So I will try and welcome people as we get a few late stragglers. But today we're going to talk about narrative voice and the different types of narrative voice that we can use in our stories. Because we may want to write our stories in different styles depending on the audience we want to write for. And so, as I said at the beginning when people were tuning in, we're going to try and wrap up in about 30 minutes today and leave some time for questions at the end. So if you do have any questions throughout this workshop, please feel free to type them into the comment section and write the word question first before your actual question, just so I can pick them out pretty easily. So narrative voice is basically the point of view in which the story is told. So think of narrative voice as like a pair of glasses that we can put on and wear and see through. And think of the glasses as, you know, we could give our readers a different pair of glasses for them to see and experience our stories. And it's up to us as authors. Remember, we are the authors. We are in charge. We can make these decisions on how we want to write our stories. We may want to give our readers a different pair of glasses so they can experience our story from a different point of view, and so different forms of narrative voice. And there are several different types of narrative voice, but today we're going to talk about kind of the 2 most commonly used types, which for most of the books that you've read and that you enjoy, they will be written in one of these 2 ways. So the first one is what we call first person. So this is when the story is written from the perspective of a character. And then second, we're gonna cover third person. So this is when the story is told by someone who isn't a character in the story. And within third person, there's two slightly different ways that we can tell the story, and I'll touch upon both of those briefly. So we're going to split this workshop into 2 parts and spend some time talking about first person and then third person. I do want to warn you that some of this might feel a bit dry, and hopefully some of this is not boring. I will try and make it as fun as possible. We will have a 2-part activity, quite a challenging activity as well. So hopefully kind of get your creative juices flowing, get your thinking caps on, and get ready for the activity, which will be coming very shortly. So let's start with first person. So let's imagine we've got a selection, we've got a box here with all different pairs of reading glasses, that we put on our head. If we were going to write a story in first person, then the glasses that we would give our reader would belong to one of the characters. So we would be writing our story from the perspective of the character. So all of the events in the story are told from the perspective of that character. And more often than not, it's often the protagonist, the lead character, that the story is told through. So the reader experiences the story through the eyes of that character. And when writing in first person, we often use kind of the pronouns we use are kind of I, we, me, us, my, our. So let me give you an example. Hopefully this is making sense. Please tell me in the comments if it isn't. But let me give you an example. I'm going to bring back Boris. For those of you who've been tuning in every week, you will know Boris is my kind of imaginary friend character that I use for various different examples. And so you may remember from last week that Boris, from my attempt at the 7-part activity, Boris lived in a quiet village and his parents decided they were going to move to New York, and Boris wasn't happy about this. So I'm going to use that scene now as an example to show you how this would play out if we were to write this as part of a story in first person from the perspective, from the point of view of Boris. So here goes. Boris, said Mummy. Yes, I answered. I have some news. Can we sit down, please? She replied awkwardly. What is it? I asked. Panic quickly set in. Something was wrong, I could tell. I've been offered a job in New York. We're moving next month. I felt the blood rush straight to my cheeks. What about my friends? What about school? What about me? I will not, I screamed, and stormed out the room. So there we have a scene which is told from the perspective of Boris. So I'm sure you'll agree that, when we hear that, when we would read that, we would experience that scene as if we were in Boris's shoes. So because we can listen to his thoughts and understand how he's feeling. Because Boris, the character, is telling us that in the narrative. So you'll notice there was lots of I's there. I answered, I asked. And then he kind of gives us a glimpse into how he's feeling. I felt the blood rush straight to my cheeks. What about my friends? What about school? What about me? So the character is speaking directly to the reader. Hopefully that makes sense. Because in this example, which I've just given, Boris is the character, but he's also the narrator. He is also telling the story. So the reader is experiencing this scene through the eyes of Boris. And he's explaining how the story unfolds. So you may decide, this may be your preferred writing style. You may like to write your stories in first person. So, if you create a character, the lead character, you may well write the story from the perspective of the character. And these are all choices we can make as writers. When we have an idea for a story, we can use these different options and experiment. It's definitely worth experiment, and the activity today will allow you to do that, so you can compare and contrast. And, you know, you should write the way that you feel comfortable with and you prefer. You know, if you prefer to write in first person, and when we come on to third person, you'll see. But these are all choices. And as writers, it's important that we understand the wealth of options that we have that we can consider when we're writing our stories. So, you know, and like all of these decisions and options we have, there are pros and cons to them. So, you know, if we're going to write a story in first person, so we write the story from the perspective of a character, I guess some of the good things about that is that, you know, it sounds really personal. It's intimate. It's kind of like the character is speaking directly to the reader. And that can be quite powerful. And, you know, thinking about characterization, we can really help the reader to get to know a character if the character is speaking directly to the reader and is kind of telling the story to the reader. And it also allows us to get into the character's mind. We can really understand how the character feels all the way through the story because we're experiencing the story from the perspective of that character. I guess some of the downsides, or not downsides, but limitations when writing in first person are that the reader, I guess, only gets to experience the story from that character's perspective. You know, which you know could be biased. You know, it is that character may have views which aren't completely objective, and because of that, we only get to experience the other characters in the story through the eyes of our main character who is telling the story. So we might not get to know the other characters as well, and we might not get to know all of the different sides to these different characters because we're seeing them through the eyes of our lead character. You can, of course, write your stories in first person, but from multiple characters. And you know, many authors do this. For example, if we use the scene, what I've just used as an example there, you know, where Boris finds out from his mummy that he's moving to New York, the first chapter could be written by, told from Boris's perspective. And then the next chapter could be from his mummy's perspective. And, you know, this is quite a popular way for writers to write their stories because they like the first person style. And so they have that level of directness between the character and the reader and that kind of level of intimacy between the character and the reader. But this way we also get to expose the reader to the points of view of the other characters in our story. And of course, different characters will have different perspectives to the same situation. So that conversation between Boris and his mummy, you know, if I wrote that from the perspective of his mummy, it would be different because she would have experienced that conversation in a different way than what Boris did. And that again is another option when writing in first person. So you could, for example, you may have written a story already in third person, which we'll come on to shortly, and you may want to try and write it in first person. You know, so the lead character in your story, have a play around. You know, why not write a story that you've already written, but write it in third person? Why not try it out in first person? You never know, you may prefer it that way, and it may lift the story to greater heights. So again, these are all options we have at our disposal as authors. You know, we are in charge. We are the ones who create the characters, the setting, the world in which our characters exist. We write the story, we come up with the ideas, and we can also choose whether we write it in first person or in third person. There was a question there, and I should have mentioned, let me just scroll up quickly. Is there such thing as second person? I'm sure somebody asked that. I'm sure somebody did ask that. There is such thing as writing in second person. This is not very common, but I think there's some pretty famous, well-known books that have been written in this way. But it's not that common. It's not that popular, and to be honest, I don't quite understand it well enough to be able to talk about it like this. But if that's of interest to you, to write the story from second person, then you should give it a Google and have a look. There's loads of good materials out there. So this is writing in first person. I'm hoping this is making sense. Like I said, it can be a bit dry. So apologies. I'm trying to make this as interesting as possible. But it is important as authors that we understand these different options so we can experiment with different styles, try things out, and find our own way of writing. This is all about improving, getting better, and just trying things out. That's the beauty of it, of creativity. Whether we're writing music or painting or writing stories, we can try things out. And there's no pressure, and we can see what we like and play around. So a good thing to do, like I just mentioned, if you've already written a story, then and you've written it in first person or third person, maybe try and write a little bit of it in a different style. So if you've written a story in third person, maybe try in first person and see how it feels to you. It's all down to your personal preference, whatever you want. So let's have the first part of an activity. Another good thing you can do actually as well is at home, if you've got a few books at home, maybe pick out 5 of your favorite books at home and just have a read of the first 1 or 2 pages, and you'll soon know if it's told in first person, so it's told from the perspective of a character, or it's not from first person, it's from third person, or it could be second person. Second person is it's not that commonly used, and it is quite I find it quite complicated to explain. I think a good example is kind of Sherlock Holmes, the original books, which are told from that they're about Sherlock Holmes, but they're told from the perspective of Dr. Watson, and so it's that's a good example. But again, it's not that common. Let's have the first part of an activity. So I did warn you, this is going to be a bit of a difficult one. So I would like you to use a little bit of what we learned in characterization and the settings workshops. And I would like you to write 1 or 2 sentences from the perspective of a character that you were just going to make up now. You don't need to create a character name or anything yet. So I would like you to write 1 or 2 sentences told from the perspective of a character, which includes the following. The character is walking to a bus stop. The character is in a bad mood. Somebody bumps into the character. The character misses the bus. So I would like you to write 1 or 2 sentences told from the perspective of this character. The character doesn't have a name, but you can, the way you write it, you can create this character to be how you want it to be. But the character has to walk to the bus stop. The character's in a bad mood. The character bumps into, or somebody bumps into the character, and then the character misses the bus. So while you think about that, and it would be great, so you can write this down at home, and feel free to write your activity in the comment section, and I'll pick some out. Let me give you my example. So here goes. So this is in first person, so it's told from the perspective of the character. Here goes. I hated Mondays, especially when I was late for work and it was rush hour. I spotted the number 7 bus up ahead. I picked up the pace, trying to weave in and out of the crowds, when an elderly lady bumped into me and I dropped my briefcase. Oi, watch where you're going, I huffed, quickly picking up my briefcase from a puddle. I looked up and the bus had gone. So now hopefully from that, you'll have quickly came to realise that the character who is telling the story, in this instance, this is in first person, is probably not that nice a person. Or at the very least, the character is not in a good mood. And although the scene is told from the perspective, the point of view of that character, it's not necessarily that character that the reader empathises with. I would feel more empathy and sympathy with the elderly lady who bumped into the character and then was told off. So let's. So while you come up with your activity, so remember, activity told in. Write down 1 or 2 sentences in first person from the perspective of the character. The character is walking to the bus stop. The character's in a bad mood. Somebody bumps into the character, and the character then misses the bus. Not an easy one, but write that down on your paper. But also write down, if you'd like to, in the comment section, and I'll pick out a few examples. So while you do that, let's move on to third person. So we've just talked about writing stories in first person. So when we write a story from the point of view of one or more of the characters, and this can be a really powerful way to build intimacy between the character and the reader, because the character is speaking directly to the reader. Now we're going to talk about third person. So let's bring out our box of imaginary reading glasses again. Remember, a narrative voice could be a pair of glasses. Whereas in first person, we were giving the reader a pair of glasses which belonged to one of the characters, so the reader could experience the story through the eyes and the lens of one of the characters. With third person, we're giving the reader a pair of glasses that allows them almost to be like an invisible person in the room. You know, somebody who is in the story but is kind of invisible and kind of spying on all the characters and is just watching, observing and listening and kind of telling the reader what is going on. So that's kind of, they're like these superpowers, some super glasses that allow them to be invisible and to listen and watch and observe all of the things that are going on, how the characters play out the story. So when we write in third person, those glasses don't belong to any of the characters, and it allows this invisible person to kind of tell the story for the reader. So third person is very popular, particularly in children's books. So all of my books are in third person. Roald Dahl's books are generally third person. All the Harry Potter books are third person. And it allows, third person is great because it does allow us as authors to expose the reader to all of the characters, and opens the hearts and minds of the different characters to the reader. So kind of we, the author, are narrating the story direct to the reader, not via one of the characters. So whereas in first person, the pronouns that we would use in first person, we would use lots of I, we, me, us, my, our. In third person, we use she, he, her, his, they, it. So let's bring back Boris. And the example I used earlier for the first person section. So remember the scene where Boris's mummy tells him that he's moving to New York. And let me just do the first person example again, and then I'll do it in third person so you can see the difference. So this is in first person. Boris, said Mummy. Yes, I answered. We have some news. Can you sit down, please? She replied awkwardly. What is it? I asked, panic quickly setting in. Something was wrong, I could tell. I've been offered a job in New York. We're moving next month. I felt the blood rush straight to my cheeks. What about my friends? What about school? What about me? I will not, I screamed and stormed out the room. So that was in first person. Now let's try that same scene, exactly the same, but in third person. Boris, said Mummy. Yes, answered Boris. We have some news. Can you sit down, please? She replied awkwardly. What is it? Asked Boris, panic quickly setting in. Something was wrong, he could tell. I've been offered a job in New York. We're moving next month. Boris felt the blood rush straight to his cheeks and his mind raced. What about his friends? What about school? What about him? I will not, he screamed before storming out the room. So you see, it's kind of, that probably wasn't the best example there because it didn't really draw out, the third person, the difference between third person and first person too much. But you can see that it's a different experience and perspective for the reader. In the first example, the reader is experiencing that conversation between Boris and his mummy through the eyes of Boris. The reader is in Boris's shoes. And then in the second example, the reader is kind of being told what's going on, is being relayed and narrated the story by this, person or thing that's invisible in the room, is there and is kind of watching and listening. So personally, I actually prefer third person, which is why I write my stories in third person. But again, just to repeat myself, is that you can make these choices. It's all down to your personal preference. So conscious of time, but there's a few more bits and pieces to cover here because I want to dive a little bit deeper into third person because without going into too much detail because of time and a lot of this can get a little bit boring, to be honest, and quite technical and everything else. But that when writing in third person, there are different ways that we can do that. Similar to first person, first person we could write from the perspective of one character all the way through the story, but we could also write in first person from the point of view of different characters in the story. In third person, there are a number of different ways we can use, but the two kind of most common styles for writing in third person are third person limited, so this is a bit where it might get a bit dull, and then third person omniscient, which I always struggle to say, omniscient, third person omniscient. So let me just quickly cover both of those because there is a difference. So third person limited, so Harry Potter, all of the Harry Potter books are told in third person limited. It's a good example. So what this means is that the story is not told from a character's point of view, but it generally sticks closely to one character throughout the story. So if we look at Harry Potter, they're all told in third person. They're not written from the perspective of Harry. Harry isn't telling the story, but Harry is the focal point. So the story is told with Harry as the focal point throughout. And this is a good way to build interest and heighten suspense, because the reader learns along with the characters. So the reader doesn't have an overall unlimited view of what all the characters are thinking and feeling at any one time. So it's like the reader has these superpowers, they're invisible, and they can be watching all of the action unfold. So third person limited is probably the most common form of third person. I hope you're staying with me. Hopefully this is making sense. Third person omniscient it is now like those superpowers have taken to a whole new level. It's where the narrator has unlimited knowledge of what is going on at all times. So in the Boris example, in that scene between Boris and Mummy, if we were to write that in third person omniscient, we would write it in a way so the reader understands how Boris is feeling, but also how his mummy is feeling as well. So that's the slight difference. It's kind of like a whole bird's eye view of all of the story, and the narrator has everything, like can see and feel everything from across all of the different characters. So I'm conscious there's a lot of information here, and it can get a bit dry. If you don't understand any of this, or some of it just kind of doesn't quite make sense, then please feel free to drop me a message, or just watch back the video at a later time if you get time. And I will be doing a highlights reel, which I do from each week, which hopefully you have seen. Let's finish with the second part of the activity. So I can see some of you, fantastic, have done the first part of the activity. Fantastic. Now, basically, what I would like you to do for the second part is to write the same scene, but in third person. What you could do is, at home, write them next to each other, or below each other, so you can see the difference, see the contrast. If you would like to, you can share the both parts of the activity in the same comment, and then I can read both of them out. So let me just read out Joe's, because Joe's is lovely. So this is Joe's first person part of the activity. So this is, I'm going to read this out now. Let me have a look and get all of it up. I walked slowly to the bus stop. Rain was pouring on my face, spraying droplets on my scratched glasses. My feet splashed the water on the road. And water, oh sorry, it keeps moving for me. And water dropped off my neon orange raincoat, which my mother had bought me. Who buys a 13-year-old a bright orange raincoat? I looked like an overgrown nursery-age child. I was in such a bad mood that I didn't notice that I had just bumped into my friend Juno. The bus pulled up on the road, but I didn't want to catch it. I walked down the street talking to Juno and silently felt relief that I didn't have to catch the bus, and my relief ran into my veins. Wonderful. Brilliant. I love it. Fantastic. So, a real sense there. The character is speaking directly to the reader, so this is in first person. Also a little bit of humour in there about the raincoat. Who buys a 13-year-old a big orange raincoat? Some great kind of characterisation there around, how the character feels. We get a sense of who the character is. Also using the settings as well, the rain, the water, fantastic. Let me have a look. So there's quite a few more coming in. Let's have a look at Jennifer's. Brilliant, let's have a look. I was so sad on Saturday, which wasn't normal for me. It was raining heavily, my green wellies full of water. The rain got heavier. Suddenly, my head facing the pavement. It's the comments keep coming in, so it moves. Suddenly, my head facing the pavement, I bumped into a tall, thin old lady and fell over. The lady sneered at me and walked away. I looked up and the bus was gone. Again, brilliant. So we've got, we know how the character feels. Again, great use of, the green wellies, the rain, the water, using the settings. Fantastic, Jennifer. Brilliant. So if you, for the second part, is just to basically write that same scene, but write it in third person. And this is something that you can do, that you can experience, experiment with at home when you're writing. Some stories might be suited better to being told in first person. Some may be suited better to be written in third person. But ultimately, it's kind of what you prefer. Which style of writing do you want? What type of writer do you want to be? And who do you want to write for? Who is your audience? What type of stories do you want to write for? These are all things that we don't necessarily have to answer immediately, but we can just keep them in mind and, evolve as writers just by trying to absorb as much of the different options that we have at our disposal. So let me, that's great. So conscious of time, we've actually ran over. There was a few questions. So I'll answer a few questions just for a few minutes and then I will need to go on, conscious of your time. But just to recap what we've covered today. So we've talked about narrative voice, how we can write our stories from different perspectives. There are lots of different narrative voices. There's kind of first person, second person, which I didn't cover today, which isn't that common and I find a bit difficult to kind of get my head around. But you can Google it, check it out. Third person, which we talked about today, and then there's different variations of third person. But we mainly covered first person, which is when we write the story from the point of view of a character, or we can write it from multiple characters. So the reader experiences the story through the eyes of that character. So we use lots of I, we, me, us, my, our, and this is first person, where the character is speaking directly to the reader. And then we talked about writing in third person, so when we write stories which are from outside any of the characters' point of view. So it's kind of like we're spying on all the characters and we can see what's going on, and we're kind of telling the reader what we can see and what is happening, and describing the characters and where they are and everything else. And that's third person. And so in that we often use kind of she, he, her, his, they, it. Both first person and third person are generally the most common and popular ways of writing stories. So I can almost guarantee that the majority, or if not all of the books that you have read, or the vast majority of them, will have been written in either first person or third person. And you can experiment and choose. So have a look at the books that you have at home. Pick your 3 or 4 or 5 favourite books at home, and just have a look and see if they're written in first or third person. You may find that you have a preference for one. And that's, when you're writing your stories, you want to write in a way which you enjoy. So these are all options on the table when we're writing stories. We are the authors, we are in charge, we create the characters, we come up with the ideas, we create the settings, and we can decide whether we, how we tell the story, whether that's through the perspective of a character or whether it's in first person or whether it's third person.